you. Good morning, my fellow Texans.
Good morning.
It's good to be here with you today. I want to take you back in time. 183 years and 6 days. It was my birthday. March the 2nd, 1836. There were a group of 59 Texans gathered in a room in a building that was still under construction. It wasn't even as big as the room we're in today. The weather was like it was Monday. A cold north wind rushing in, and the windows didn't even have glass, so they were freezing, huddled together. They had to put blankets on the walls to keep warm. They were there to sign a document called a Declaration of Independence. Now can someone tell me what that is? Right there.
A Declaration of Independence is kind of like a contract.
Yes, that's right.
It's a sheet of paper that states all of the rules about how a certain nation or a piece of land will be independent.
Yes, that's right. Anybody else?
It's something that you sign to make a state independent.
That's very good. A statement to the people of the whole world that we have a right, because of abuses of our mother country, to become a separate nation. Where else had you heard that term? A Declaration of Independence.
When America wanted its independence from
That's right. 60 years before that, when America separated from,
Great Britain.
and now Texas was separating from.
Mexico.
That is correct. I was one of the 59 men in that room, not 500, but 59 men in that room, named Sam Houston. I have a couple of things with me today. I have a cane, and I have an Indian blanket. Does anyone know why I carry these with me all the time? Right there.
Because you were an adopted son from India.
Right. I became an adopted son of the Cherokee Nation for 5 years of my life. Yes.
I sent you to your king because in the battle before Freedom you got injured.
That's exactly right. There was another time I was injured. When was that?
In the Big Bend battle.
That's right. The Big Bend battle. Anybody else? Okay.
Sam Houston.
That is right. You got it. I see you already know a good bit. Now, I was not born in Texas. I was born in the state of Virginia. Does anyone know where Virginia is?
No.
Okay.
The U.S.
Yes, it is. It's sort of that way. Now, if you were to go there, oh, yes.
Was the colony?
Yes, it was one of the 13 colonies. If you were to go by plane, you could get there in 2 hours. But in the way we traveled in those days, by horse and by cart and wagon, it would take you 6 weeks of travel from here to get there. Camping out every night, rugged roads, it would have been a really hard trip. My daddy fought in the American Revolution under General George Washington. Who was George Washington? First president. Before that, he was the general of the Continental Army. Now, my daddy was a real good soldier and officer in the Army, but he wasn't such a good businessman. I was born on a plantation in Virginia that had been in my family for 4 generations, started by my great-great-granddaddy. After the American Revolution, my father remained in the Army. Our plantation was going into bankruptcy. That means they were in debt. What does it mean to be in debt? Out of money. You owe money that you don't have to pay. My daddy died when I was only 13 years old. Now, we had 9 children in our family. I was right in the middle. I was the 5th child. I had 4 older brothers. Does anybody here have older brothers? What's it like having older brothers? Annoying. They sort of boss you around, don't they? That's the way it was in my family. I had 4 older brothers, but no daddy to sort of referee the fights between us. Now, my mother was forced to sell our plantation in Virginia in order to pay the debts, and she moved us far to the west. Now today, when you think of the West, you think of California. In those days, you thought of Tennessee, the Smoky Mountains. Anyone ever been to the Smoky Mountains? Really pretty, isn't it? So we moved to the West, had a farm, and my older brothers thought that I should become a farmer. The problem with that, I didn't like working out in the fields.
That's why you ran away to the Comanche Indians.
Boy, she's got it right. But there's another thing they wanted me to do before that. Anybody remember?
Oh, never mind.
They bought a store, and they thought, well, if you want to be a farmer, you could be a storekeeper. But I didn't like sitting behind the store all day. There were two things that I loved, boys and girls.
Adventure.
Yes, you got it. We'll get into that.
And reading.
Anybody else? What else did I love?
The Native Americans.
That's good. What? Reading. Reading. Didn't have the internet in those days, didn't have TV, radio. If you wanted to learn about the big world outside of where you live, you learned through books. And even today, reading books is still the best way to learn about what's beyond the place where you live. So I read every book I could get my hands on. I memorized the Iliad by Homer, most of the Odyssey, great passages of the Bible. I love books on adventure. I love books on world history. And so there's another thing that I loved.
You learn things by yourself?
Pardon?
You learn things by yourself?
That's correct. With books, once you know how to read well, the whole world of information is open to you. There's a second thing I loved. I loved the free life of the American Indian. So someone just said it earlier. What did I do when I was 16 years old? Ran away from home. Where did I run to? Does anybody remember? Yes. What was the name of the place? Cayuga Town. And who was, okay, and who was the chief of the Indians?
I forgot.
Uluteka. Can you say that? Uluteka. Uluteka. What was the name they gave me? The Raven. What's a raven?
It's a type of bird. It's a
Big, powerful black bird.
very respected in the Native Americans.
That's correct. So I was called Colone. Say that. Colone. The Raven. I like living with the Indians. You know what I like? Indian boys don't do household chores or work in the field. That's done by the women and the children. Now, how many here think that's a better system, where the women and the children do the household chores and the boys go hunting and fishing and play games of war? How many think that's better than we have today? How many think that's not as good a system? Seems like the boys and the girls have some disagreement on this. But that's the way it was in Cayuga Town. After a couple of years, and I learned the Indian language, I was in debt, so I went back home to Maryville, my hometown in Tennessee, and I started a school. What was the name of the school? Sam Houston's Schoolhouse. Taught boys and girls just like you, reading, writing, numbers, things they needed to know. That lasted only a year, and I decided I should get some more education myself, so I enrolled in the academy at Maryville. It exists today. It's called Maryville College. Maybe some of you might go there someday. That didn't last too long because, see, the year was 1813. And a few months later, what had happened in America?
The Texas Revolution.
Well, not that, but you're close. Another war had started with England called the War of... Anybody remember?
The War of Dazzle.
No, that's close. Anybody? No, that's part of it. The War of 1812, and one day there marched into our town a recruiting party from the U.S. Army. They had beautiful blue uniforms. Ooh, I lost something there, huh? Something came off the table. A button. It was bust our buttons in those days too, didn't it? So, I loved their uniforms. I remembered my daddy's war story, so I enlisted in the U.S. Army, the lowest rank, a private. A few months later, I was promoted to officer, a lieutenant. And my commanding officer was, anybody remember the name?
The Rangers.
No. No, his name Andrew Jackson. Anyone know who Andrew Jackson is?
The Colonel.
Anybody have $20 bill? I do. You used to like to have a lot of those. See, that's his picture. Andrew Jackson. He became the 7th president of the United States, but he was the general of the army at that time. And a few months later, in the state of Alabama, I was in a battle. Someone's already given the name. The Battle of
The Horseshoe Bend.
the Horseshoe Bend. General Jackson ordered me to take my men. Yes, right there.
You got injured?
Yes,
In the leg?
that's
And
correct. And where else?
You kept, no, I don't know what the other place, but you kept on fighting and then you got promoted, right?
Right, well, what happened, we were to go over a wall. I was wounded. I took an arrow in the leg, 2 bullets in the shoulder. And I fell on the battlefield. They took me to the medical tent, but the doctor said, he won't even last the night. No sense in going through the pain of surgery. Didn't have anesthesia in those days. So they left me there to die. But boys and girls, I did not die. I survived. It took me more than a year to recover from those wounds, but recover I did. And a year later ended up in Washington, D.C. in the inner circle of Andrew Jackson in the U.S. Army. Stayed in the Army 5 years. Then went back to my home state of Tennessee, studied to become a lawyer, became a county lawyer. I also stayed in the military, yes.
You went to a politics school that was supposed to last for 18 months, but you did so good that you finished in 6 months.
You were right. Most people, see, I wasn't going to tell you all that, but she said it took people in those days 18 months to be a lawyer, but I did it in 6. I was also a member of the Tennessee militia and was elected by my fellow officers commanding general of the Tennessee militia. Then what happened? What did I do next?
Oh, wait, I think I was gonna name the Tennessee General.
Well, before that, I ran for Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives. I served there for 2 terms for 4 years. Came back to Tennessee, and what did I do next? I think someone just said it.
Went to Texas.
No?
Davy Crockett.
Well, Davy Crockett he was just a few years older than me.
I think you joined the Texas Revolution.
Not quite. I was elected governor of Tennessee at the age of 32, the youngest man ever to be elected governor of Tennessee. In addition to that, 4 years later, I ran again. Now, I was not married at the time. In fact, I had a reputation of being a little bit wild, and so folks said to me, Sam,
You married another girl who was just a teenager, but your relationship didn't go that well, so she left you, but then you went back to, because people kept on making fun of you, thinking that you treated her badly, so you left and went to the command.
Well, she said it right. She said the whole thing. I married a girl 17 years younger than me. She left me in 3 weeks. When the newspapers got wind of that, it was a big scandal. I was ruined politically, financially, personally. So I resigned my position as governor of Tennessee, got on a flatboat, went down the river, joined up again with,
Another girl, but I forgot her name.
well, yes, but I joined the Comanche Indians, Chief Uluteka. They had moved to the river, and I set up a trading post. Whereas before they knew me as the Raven, now I was only known as, I hate to say, but the big drunk. I took to drinking. But you see, in those days, the Cherokee Indians were having problems. They needed a friend in Washington, D.C. And Chief Uluteka knew that I was a good friend of the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson. So I was adopted and made an official member of the Cherokee tribe and sent to Washington, D.C. as ambassador of the Cherokee Nation. I didn't even own a set of American clothing like this. I wore Indian clothing. I spoke the Indian language. I was their ambassador in Washington. And while in Washington, does anyone know a story about what happened to me? Right there.
You weren't allowed in because you were wearing
Hmm?
You weren't allowed in because you were wearing
Well, no, what, that may have happened, but
You weren't allowed in the Capitol because you were wearing Indian clothing, so you got mad and quit.
well, no, I got mad, but I didn't quit. There was a congressman who accused me of wrongdoing. He accused me of taking government money and putting it into my own pocket. So I challenged him to a duel.
I think he pointed a gun at you.
That's right.
And you,
If
stopped
the
him.
gun didn't fire, if the gun had fired, Sam Houston would not be here talking to you today.
But you died in the
Well, but so we got in a big fight on the streets later on, and I took my cane and I thrashed him pretty good. I was taken before a hearing in the U.S. Capitol, before the U.S. House of Representatives. It lasted a month. Big media event, the newspapers covered it all over America. If it were today, it would be on Fox News and CNN, and every night it would be that kind of a story. My attorney was Francis Scott Key. Who was Francis Scott Key? Does anyone know?
He wrote the Star
He wrote the Star Spangled Banner, that's right. But I gave my own closing argument in front of a full house of the United States House of Representatives, was greeted with a standing ovation, and I was cleared with a mere slap on the wrist. It was then that I knew I wanted back into public life. But where to go? I decided then to go to a place called Texas. Went back down the river, closed my trading post. Now, this young lady pointed out that I had taken a wife among the Cherokee, but divorce wasn't big with them in those days. It wasn't a big matter. She didn't want to go to Texas. I traded my horse for a white horse. And on December 2nd of 1832, I rode into Nacogdoches, Texas on a white horse. Now, the folks in Texas had already heard about me. Well, you see, while they didn't have internet or TV, they read newspapers. Anybody read the newspaper today?
My grandpa reads newspapers.
Yes. Anybody else? Yeah, a few of you. Most of us have never even seen newspapers today. We have other things. But they read about me in the newspapers. They heard about me as a soldier, as a congressman, as a fighter. They sort of like that in Texas. So I became a citizen of Mexico, because you see, Texas was owned by Mexico.
At that time.
Yes, that time. Now let me tell you what had happened in Texas before I got there. 300 years earlier, in the 1500s, there were a group of Spaniards who were shipwrecked on Galveston Island.
That's how they discovered Texas.
Yes. And the name of the leader was Cabeza de Vaca. They had no place to go. They couldn't get on their cell phones and say, "Hey, pick us up here. We're in Galveston." They were stuck. They had no one to turn.
They didn't even know it was Galveston.
They didn't even, it wasn't even called that. Senor Galvez had not been born by that time. So they were stuck. They went to live among first the Karankawa, then the Coquitlam.
Cabeza de Vaca became a good friend of the Native Americans, just like you did, because he performed a surgery of an arrow from an Indian.
That is correct. We'll get to that in a second here. They were considered slaves of the Indians for 5 years. 5 years later, 1 year later, out of the 80 men, only 12 were still alive, because you see, Texas was a tough place to survive for people who were from Europe. They were accustomed to the easy life of European civilization. So only 12 were left alive. Of those, 5 escaped. Under Cabeza de Vaca, they traveled to the west over 2 years, 2,500 miles. They were befriended by good Indian tribes. And in the one case, which this young lady mentioned, there was a man who had a bullet lodged near his heart. Cabeza de Vaca went in and removed the bullet. They thought he was a miracle worker. They helped it.
A shaman back in Europe, or Spain, yeah.
That's right. So they thought he was a great man. Go ahead, yes.
They thought he he was like a god.
Like a god, some of them thought. So when he and his friends arrived at the western part of Mexico around the year 1840, they carried with them tales, gold, silver, and great treasure in Texas. The people of Spain were very excited, so they set up a couple of great expeditions. Well, who was the commander of the big expedition to go into Texas? Well, but he was the Texas commander. Who was the Spanish commander? No, close. Coronado.
Oh, yep.
The Coronado expedition. 1,000 men, 1,500 horses and pack mules. They left with a great ceremony. Coronado riding in shining armor on a great white horse. The people cheering as they left. Then things got tough. They went into Texas. All they found were poor Indian villages, great herds of buffalo. They discovered the Grand Canyon. Anyone ever been to the Grand Canyon? Yes, it looked just the same then as it does today. They discovered another thing, this black stuff seeping up out of the ground called oil, but to them it was of no use at all. They said nobody could ever use that stuff, so they went back to Mexico, lost all their money, left Texas to be ruled by the Indians for the next 150 years. Until in about 1680, there were a group of Frenchmen, 200 in all. And their leader was named La Salle. They were shipwrecked also. And they built a fort called, what's the name of the fort? Fort St. Louis. Yes. Of the 200, only a couple dozen were alive a year later. For you see, Texas was a tough place to survive for people from Europe who were accustomed to the easy ways of European civilization. 7 of those finally made their way back to France, and La Salle was not one of them. They told King Louis of France about a beautiful place called Texas. So in the year 1700, here was the situation in the world. Louisiana. Where's Louisiana? Anybody know?
That way.
That way, east of Texas. Okay, I've got my directions mixed up. East of Texas, Louisiana was owned by France, and they thought they owned Texas. Mexico was owned by Spain, and they thought they owned Texas. But see, the Spanish knew that in order to claim Texas as their own, they had to have people there. So they tried to get Spaniards to move to Texas, gave them free land, but the Spaniards wouldn't go. Why wouldn't the Spaniards go to Texas?
Because the Native Americans and like kind of.
Yeah, you bet. You bet.
Because Texas was a hard place to live.
Texas was a tough place to survive for people of European descent who were accustomed to the easy ways of Western civilization. So instead they sent soldiers and priests, hoping to turn the Native Americans into good citizens of Mexico and members of the Catholic Church.
They thought that they had to spread Christianity.
Yes, they wanted. That's why the priests were willing to go to try to spread Christianity. But the Indians were not interested. And 70 years later, all they had to show for themselves were 3 cities in Texas. Does anyone know the name of the 3 cities in Texas?
Is it Houston?
No. San Antonio, Goliad, La Bahia, and a trading post in northeast Texas called, no, Nacogdoches. Those were the 3 cities that existed in those days. That's all they had. Then in the late 1700s, exciting things began happening in the United States. What happened in 1776? Anyone? Right there.
America won independence.
Yes. 1802, President Thomas Jefferson purchases the Louisiana Territory, so most of the West becomes part of the United States. 1811, something happened in Mexico. Anybody?
They won independence.
The Mexican Revolution began in 1821.
And they took Texas with them.
In 1821, The revolutionaries won. Mexico became a separate country, and in 1821, Texas was a part of Mexico, and they had two big problems. The first was the problem of illegal immigration. Anyone ever heard of illegal immigration? But it was the other way around, not like today. It wasn't Mexicans wanting to get into the United States. It was people from the United States wanting to get into Mexico. Just the opposite. There was a second problem, much bigger. Indian raids, the Comanches, the Apaches, riding their horses hundreds of miles down into Mexico, raiding cities, burning, looting, taking away their cattle, even enslaving their wives and children. And Mexico didn't have an army to oppose them. So they came up with a novel idea to solve both problems. They said, why don't we invite people from America to come and live in Texas? That way the Indians, instead of riding all the way down into Mexico, riding hundreds of miles, will ride only 10, 20, 30 miles. They'll raid the Texas villages instead of the Mexican villages. And it worked. So they brought in impresarios from the United States who brought in settlers. What was the name of one of the impresarios?
Stephen F. Austin.
Stephen F. Anyone know another name?
Moses Austin, his father.
That was his father before him. Green DeWitt. There were Mexican impresarios who brought people up from Mexico. Why did they come from the United States? Anybody know?
Because they were giving cheap land, like they didn't put very high prices.
Yes, that's very good. High price in the United States. And in Texas, for $30 down payment, you could get up to 9 miles of land. Let's see. You go from this school all the way to Preston Road. From Preston Road all the way down to 380, that square of land, all you had to have was $30. It was all yours.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of land for a little money, so the Texans came. First there were 300, then there were 1,000. Then they came by the tens of thousands, so that about 8 years later, there were 10 times more Texians in Texas than Tejanos. What is a Texian?
Texas?
A Texan and a Mexican?
It's a Texan of U.S. descent. What's a Tejano? Right.
Native born Mexicans?
Right, born in Mexico, moved to Texas. The Texians and the Tejanos. So the government of Mexico got a little antsy about it and said, we need to cut off immigration from the United States, which they did in 1830. Caused a lot of problems. When they opened immigration once again in 1832, there were two parties formed in Texas. What were the names of the two different parties in Texas? First, there was the Peace Party and the War Party. Now, what did the Peace Party want?
Peace.
Peace. They wanted things to be as they were in 1823 under Austin when they came to Mexico, and relations were so nice with the Mexicans. The War Party were people like William B. Travis. They didn't get such a good deal, and they wanted to see Texas separate from Mexico. So they had a couple of conventions in the year 1832 and 1833. What did they want in those conventions? Does anybody remember?
To be their own country.
Well, that was one thing.
First, they wanted to be a state of Mexico.
First, that's right.
But then, when Stephen F. Austin wanted to consult with Santa Anna put him in jail. So then Texans was like, well, that's not fair.
That's
So
right.
Then they said, no, we want to be our own country. Then.
Yeah, boy, this young lady has it right. How about you? What do you say?
When Santa Anna put Stephen F. Austin in jail because he thought he wanted to start a war, the Texans got mad because they put their leader in jail.
That's right. After 1833, Stephen F. Austin went to Mexico City. The man who rose to power was Santa Anna, just as you said. He then became a dictator, and by the time Austin was released, he knew the people of Texas had only two choices. Get out of Texas or fight for independence. So fight they did. Now, I had been appointed General of the Texas Army by the time that convention occurred, that I told you about when we started, March 2nd, 1836. The first thing I did as general was go to San Antonio and tell Stephen F. Austin and Colonel Bowie, or rather Colonel Travis was the commander, get out of town, burn down the Alamo, burn down the Alamo. Get out of town, get those 25 cannons out of San Antonio before Santa Anna gets his hands on them. But they didn't listen, they waited. Santa Anna arrived on March 23rd, 1836, gave him 13 days. When they wouldn't surrender, he stormed the place. What happened? Everybody. They killed everyone. He went on to Goliad. I told Colonel Fannin at Goliad, get out of town. Bring your 400 men to the east and join up with the Army of Texas. But they didn't listen. And what happened at Goliad?
Massacre. Massacre.
There was a Matthew. They were executed, all but a few. So, in March of 1836, I had an army of 400. Santa Anna had 4,000.
When they were executed, they did like the lottery. I think people who drew black beans were executed. People who drew light beans were saved.
Now that happened a few years later under another president. We'll get to that. So, there we were. We had 400 men. We retreated to the east, all the while recruiting men and training them so that on the 20th of April of 1836, we found ourselves face to face with Santa Anna's army in a place called San Jacinto, or in the English tongue, San Jacinto. Now, that part of his army had 1,000 men. We had 1,000 men. But he had 500 men on the way who would arrive that day. So Santa Anna knew that we would have to attack the next day, lest we be greatly outnumbered. So,
So you trained your army, and then when they were sleeping, you went and defeated them?
that's right. Now let's talk about what happened the night before. The night before, Santa Anna decided to build a wall of defense. They piled up saddles, saddlebags, and supply crates and logs, and they built this makeshift wall. They worked all night, exhausting work, so that on the morning of 21st of April, 1836, they were lined up behind that wall with their rifles pointed down that hill, waiting for us to come. But we didn't come. We held our fire. In the middle of the afternoon, as this young lady said, we came up the mountain. We took them by surprise. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. They were scattered. Santa Anna was captured the next day and brought to me. I offered him a deal he couldn't refuse. In exchange for his life, he agreed to 3 things. Anyone know what he agreed to?
He agreed to let Texas be.
That's right, be a separate country, and?
To let all the prisoners,
Yes,
free.
yes,
And never have war between Mexico and Texas. And to not have war between Mexico.
that's right. Well, that's right, coming up.
He said that he would make all the other people in Mexico recognize Texas.
That's correct. And the border would be?
The Rio Grande.
The Rio Grande. And he also called off his army. I was wounded in the battle, in the leg. Taken to New Orleans. Somebody said? Yes. Go ahead.
And when San Jacinto ended and Santa Anna tried to run away, one of his own men
Said,
found him.
El Presidente! There he is! El Presidente! That's what they said. Yes. I was taken to New Orleans, where I spent about 6 weeks recovering. Went back to Texas, and what happened when I got back to Texas?
You were elected president?
First president of the Republic of Texas. I wanted three major things when I was the first president. What did I want? Right there.
The Native Americans to stay in Texas.
Yes, and have peace with them, that's right. Number two, right there.
To pay off that large debt Texas had?
Yes, that was tough.
To join the United States.
To join the United States, and one more thing,
To make peace with Mexico.
peace with Mexico. You've got them all. You've been well educated in Texas history. The second president of the Republic of Texas was Mirabeau B. Lamar. He wanted just the opposite of what I wanted. What did he want with the Indians?
War.
War.
Out!
Out.
Or war. Get rid of them. What did he want with Mexico?
He wanted to fight with them.
Well, he wanted to take control of their northern territories and build a great nation all the way to the Pacific. What about the United States? What did he want with them?
He didn't want them to be a part of Texas.
That's right. He didn't want Texas to be a state. He wanted to create a large nation that would be a rival to the United States, allied with the nations of Europe. Who was the third president of Texas?
Anson Jones.
Well, I was the third term. The fourth was Anson Jones. Under Anson Jones, Texas was
Texas was
annexed into the United States, the 28th state. I was sent as a senator to Washington, D.C. in the turbulent years of the 1850s. What was going on in the 1850s in the United States? Does anyone know? There was struggle between the northern and southern states.
The Civil War.
That's coming up. I was the only senator in the South that wanted to see Texas stay as a part of the Union. I was called a Unionist. So I knew that was not popular in Texas. 1859, I resigned as a senator, came, and what happened in 1860 in my career? Elected governor of Texas, 1860. Moved to the capital, had been established in Austin. And in 1861, what happened in the United States? Someone just said the Civil War. Texas wanted to join the southern states. I wanted to join the Union. That was not popular, so I was removed from office, and that was the end of my political career. Now, boys and girls, in my lifetime, I knew and worked with every president of the United States, from Thomas Adams to Abraham Lincoln. They even wanted me to run against Lincoln for president in 1860, but I didn't want to do that. That's why I came to Texas. I was a citizen of 5 different countries. He came at one time. But I started as a citizen of the United States, became a citizen of the Indian Nation, Cherokee Nation, became a citizen of Mexico, a citizen of Texas, citizen of the Confederacy, ended my life as a citizen of the United States. The story of my life is the story of beginning all over again. I had to do that several times. When my family moved to Tennessee after my daddy died, I started over again. With the Indians, I started all over again. Sam Houston Schoolhouse, joining the Army, moving to Washington, becoming a politician. Time of starting all over again. And just as you must have a time of starting over again, there must be a place of beginning again. For me, the greatest place of beginning again was the same place where millions of people have come over the last 500 years. Some were Indians from the north coming down to get away from their enemies. Some were Europeans shipwrecked, no place to go. Americans coming for land and greater freedom. Mexicans coming up to get out of the hands of dictators. And through the centuries afterwards, people from all over the world, some of your parents even, came to this place to start a new life. A place of beginning again. A place called Texas. Boys and girls, thank you for your kind attention. Any questions? Any questions?
If you're here, then why does it say in the book that you died of pneumonia?
Well, I've come back. I've come back. That's okay. It'll come back and you can ask it again. There's someone over here.
How old are you?
Well, let's see. If I was born in 1793, that made me pretty old, wouldn't it?
Yes.
But I ain't that old. Yeah, that well older than that. But the guy who's playing Sam Houston today is only 72 years old.
If you did go back then, how were you walking with carrying up your cane?
Well, I could use my cane to get around. I always have a
Okay,
cane.
guys, make sure your questions are reasonable.
Okay.
Okay.
Are you actually serious?
Well, not actually. My name is Fred Cooper, and I live in Frisco. And I have a son who lives in Prosper. And I have two grandchildren who go to Cockrell Elementary, and they're seated right back there by their mom. So that's who I am.
Didn't you have another wife?
Yes, I had three wives. I had the first one who left me, the Indian wife, and I had a wife in Texas and had 8 children. Margaret. That, remember the Battle of Horseshoe Bend? Well, my leg was the arrow and my shoulder was the bullet. See?
In the book, when you did when what's his name, Cabeza Vaca did surgery, in the book it said that he got an arrow close to his heart, not a bullet.
Oh, well, you're right. I was wrong on that one, and you're sharp and you caught me. You're right, it was an arrow. But in those days, the Indians didn't yet have bullets.
Do you know what the names were of the 8 kids?
Of the what?
Of the 8 kids?
The Indians?
The 8 children.
Oh, there were, yes, there were 8 of them. That's, I'll let you look that one up. It's time right now. You remember your question?
Did you ever kill Santa Anna?
No, Santa Anna went back, we let him go back to Mexico, and he became president a total of 11 different times in 20 years. He was pretty popular.
In the Battle of San Jacinto, how much prisoners did y'all get?
They had about 1,000 in the army. They were all taken prisoner. Most of them, after the battle, had no place to go. They just stayed and lived in Texas. Most of them just stayed and lived in Texas.
Did Mexico make another constitution since?
They've had a lot of constitutions. The presidency of Texas, of Mexico, in 50 years, in the first 50 years, how many presidents did they have in Mexico in the first 50 years of their history? Does anyone have any idea? There were 70 presidents of Mexico in 50 years. Most of them didn't even last a year. So they had several constitutions. Yes.
What did you actually do in your free time?
I didn't hear that. Oh, did I free time? I did a lot of writing, and when I was younger, I was a lawyer.
I thought Santa Anna made himself president for life.
He did, but he got kicked out. He rose to the presidency 11 times, and he was kicked out 11 times. He didn't quite make it for life. Do you know what else Santa Anna did for you? He did something for which you owe him a debt of gratitude. When he was kicked out of Mexico in 1853, he moved to New York City, living with a man, and he wanted to raise money. So he said, there's a tree in Mexico called the sapodilla tree, and we can make synthetic rubber. It didn't work. So the man lost all his money, but he noticed that Santa Anna on a summer evening would be chewing on this stuff. So Mr. Adams, the inventor, took this stuff from the sapodilla tree, mixed it with sugar and food color, and he created a product called chicle, chewing gum. So it was Santa Anna who brought chewing gum to America. Did you know that? That's right. That's true.
Are you friends with Cabeza de Vaca?
Well, Cabeza de Vaca would have lived hundreds of years before me. Yes, he lived in the 1500s. I was born in 1793, so I only knew about him.
Why was Anson Jones mad at you and committed suicide?
Well, Anson Jones, what did he do for a living?
He was president.
He was a doctor, wasn't he? And so in those days, just the politicians didn't always get along. Mirabeau Lamar was not my friend, and at first Anson Jones was my friend, and then he had some, unfortunately, he had some emotional problems, and he did commit suicide. It wasn't just that he was mad at me.
Did you ever get married before?
Well, I was married 3 times, that's enough. I lived with my third wife until my death in Huntsville, Texas. Anybody else? Well, how's our time?
I think we have lunch here in just a little, or recess really.
Okay. Do we have time for any more questions, or are we done?
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to wrap it up.
That's great. Boys and girls, you've been a tremendous audience.
Thank you so
very
much.
Thank you.